The oldest cooking site we've confirmed is a cave in South Africa called Wonderwerk, carved into a dolomite hill on the edge of the Kalahari Desert and what is now South Africa's Northern Cape. 1,000,000 years old. Ash, burned bone, burned plant material deep inside the cave, which rules out a natural fire. Something carried that fire in. Something managed it. Something used it.
That something was Homo erectus. By the time we have evidence of them cooking, the cooking had already changed their bodies. Smaller teeth, smaller gut, bigger brain. The caloric math of cooked food had already been running long enough to reshape the species. Cooking didn't improve Homo erectus. Cooking is part of why Homo erectus became us.
Richard Wrangham, the Harvard primatologist who developed what's now called the cooking hypothesis, puts it this way. Modern humans are biologically obligated to cooked food. A raw diet cannot sustain a Homo sapiens. The gut is too short, the teeth are too small. We did not discover cooking and then choose to adopt it as a convenience. We evolved around it. The fire came first, and we came second. Every human culture on Earth, without exception, has a version of this. The Pacific Northwest tribes were smoking salmon over open flame at potlatch feasts. The Plains nations were curing bison into pemmican, thin-sliced, dried over slow fire, packed with fat and berries, capable of lasting months on the move. It didn't spread from one place. It wasn't invented in the South. Every civilization that ever existed figured this out, because every civilization that ever existed descended from something that had already been doing it for a very long time. Fire cooking is not a cultural tradition. It's a biological inheritance. 1492 was not the beginning of cooking over fire. It was the moment a word got picked up off an island and started moving in a direction it had never moved before. The Taíno people were the indigenous inhabitants of the Caribbean islands that Christopher Columbus encountered on his first voyage. They hadn't always been there. The Taíno descended from Arawak tribes that had migrated northward from what is now Venezuela, spreading across the Caribbean in waves beginning around 400 BC, moving island by island over centuries until they had settled Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. By the time Columbus arrived, they had been building complex societies in the Caribbean for nearly 2,000 years. They had social stratification, leaders, intricate kinship systems. They had agriculture, they had ceremony, and they had food, a diverse array of what the islands provided. Hutia, small squirrel-like rodents that were a delicacy, skinned and tied over a fire. Fish, birds, iguanas, snakes. The archaeologist Michel Lefebvre, who oversees the Caribbean archaeology collection at the Florida Natural History Museum, has said of the Taíno cooking, "We have all sorts of descriptions that would lead us to believe their version of barbecue was probably pretty tasty."
Hutia, iguana, snake. What they cooked was a function of what they had. The Taíno weren't choosing iguana over brisket. The animal that defines American barbecue hadn't reached their island yet. So we know what they were eating. How were they cooking it?
The technique they used was a raised wooden platform, 4 posts driven into the ground, additional sticks lashed across the top. The whole structure elevated above a slow fire, so the flames never touched the food directly. Smoke and indirect heat moved through the meat over hours. The Taíno word for this structure was barabicu. When the Spanish arrived and encountered it, they tried to approximate the sound of the word and wrote it down as barbacoa. The first person to use the word in print was a Spanish explorer named Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo y Valdés in 1526, 34 years after Columbus. describing the Taíno's cooking style in his account of the Caribbean. That is the first written record of the word that became barbecue, a Spanish explorer's field notes 34 years into the conquest. The word was not a cooking method. It was not a flavor profile. It was a piece of furniture, a shelf, that happened to solve a preservation problem.
What the Spanish were naming when they wrote down barbacoa was the technology, not the taste. The technique wasn't designed to produce a flavor, it was designed to keep meat from killing you.
Picture what the Caribbean actually is. You've just killed an iguana or a hutia. It's 90 degrees, it's humid enough that everything around you is damp. You have no refrigeration, no salt in the quantities needed to cure meat the way Europeans would, no way to keep what you've caught from rotting before you can eat it. In that climate, unpreserved meat becomes dangerous within hours, not days, hours. The barabicu extended that to days, long enough to trade, to travel, to feed a community through a week without a successful hunt. It worked through two mechanisms simultaneously. The low, sustained heat dried the surface of the meat, drawing out the moisture that bacteria need to grow. And the smoke itself, the compounds released when wood burns slowly, is antimicrobial. Phenols, aldehydes, acids. They coat the surface of the meat and actively inhibit bacterial growth. You are not just drying the food, you are treating it with the chemistry of combustion. What we now think of as the defining sensory experience of barbecue, the smoke ring, the bark, the rendered fat, is the side effect of a preservation system. The flavor is what happens when you solve the problem well enough for long enough that the solution becomes the point. The Taíno used the barabicu for more than meat. It was a sleeping platform to stay above the ground and the insects. It was a storage rack for grain and goods. The same piece of infrastructure that preserved food also preserved the people sleeping on it. The Spanish named it, wrote it down, and moved on. The word barbacoa traveled with their colonial expansion, but the technique, the raised rack, the slow smoke, stayed on the island, because the island still had the same preservation problem it always had.
The French arrived on Hispaniola in the early 17th century. What they found wasn't the word circulating through Spanish colonial reports, it was the thing itself. 4 posts driven into the ground, sticks lashed across the top, a slow fire underneath. The Taíno had been building it for generations before the Spanish arrived. It was still there.
The French called it boucan. From boucan, they made a verb, boucaner, to smoke meat. And from boucaner came boucanier, a person who smokes meat. The boucaniers were these men, hunters, some French, some a mix of Europeans and escaped enslaved people who lived entirely outside the formal colonial structure. The Spanish had largely pulled back from that part of the island, and wild cattle and pigs had gone feral in the interior, animals that had been introduced by the Spanish in the 1500s and multiplied unchecked for generations. The boucaniers hunted them, butchered them, cured the meat on wooden smoking racks using the same technique the Taíno had used on the same island, and sold it to passing ships. They were running a smoked meat trade operation in the middle of the Caribbean. Business was good. The product kept. The ships kept coming.
The pirate story begins with a barbecue operation.
The Spanish spent years destroying a barbecue operation because it operated outside their tax system. The people they drove off the land became the pirate fleet that raided Spanish shipping for the next century and a half. They built the threat by eliminating the nuisance.
So, how does any of this become American barbecue?
From French, the word moved into English, carried through the colonial trade networks of the Atlantic into Virginia. The common telling goes like this. Barbecue entered English from the Caribbean, carried by English colonists who encountered the technique in the islands and brought it back to the American South. The evidence does not support that. The earliest documented use of the verb to barbecue in English appears in Virginia, somewhere between 1648 and 1661. A historian named Joseph Haynes made this case in a peer-reviewed paper published in 2023, tracing the word through French into Virginia's colonial written record. His argument has not been refuted. Not the Caribbean, not South Carolina, Virginia. And it arrived through French, not through direct contact with the Taíno. The Taíno smoked Hudea and iguana, whatever the Caribbean island provided. The buccaneers smoked feral cattle and pigs, animals the Spanish had introduced to Hispaniola and then lost control of. By the time the word reached Virginia, the animal had changed again. Pigs were still there, but farmed now, not feral. European hogs that settlers had brought with them. Alongside them, venison. White-tailed deer were plentiful in Virginia and went on the fire as readily as pork. The same word, the same fire. The animal at every stop was whatever the land happened to offer.
The Taíno had no pigs. The buccaneers had no Hudea. The Virginia colonists had no iguana. Each of them cooked with fire and smoked what was in front of them.
What wasn't the same was the technique. In Virginia, barbecue looked more like spit roasting, whole animals or large cuts suspended over an open trench of burning hardwood, closer to what Europeans already knew from home than anything the Taíno had built. The elevated rack was gone. The indirect heat was gone. The slow smoke preservation that defined the barabicu had given way to something faster, more direct, more familiar to a colonial settler's eye. The word had traveled. The technique it described had been replaced entirely. By 1733, less than a century after the word first appeared in the Virginia written record, barbecue in America already meant more than a cooking method. It meant an event, a gathering, people coming together outdoors to eat. The word had outgrown its cooking definition before anyone in England had caught up. By 1755, Samuel Johnson, who published what was then the authoritative English dictionary, defined to barbecue as to cook a pig. Not any event, not any gathering, a pig. Johnson was in London. He saw the cooking and missed the culture entirely. The Taíno weren't in that definition. The buccaneers weren't in it. Just a pig, and an Englishman's certainty that this was what the word had always meant. In America, the word had already moved somewhere his dictionary couldn't follow.
By the early 1800s, it had moved somewhere else entirely.
Not just a cooking method, not just a gathering, a political institution. Candidates running for office threw barbecues. You'd secure a field, dig the pits, invite the county, feed hundreds or sometimes thousands of people on whole animals cooked through the night. Speeches, drinking, deal-making, votes exchanged over a plate of pork. It was the political rally of its era, and it was inseparable from a specific kind of American, frontier, Southern, working, loud. Andrew Jackson built his entire political identity around this image. His supporters were the barbecue crowd. His opponents, largely urban, Eastern, educated men who considered themselves a cut above, looked at that culture and saw something to mock.
And then 1829.
Jackson hosted a barbecue in the White House grounds that year. His whole political identity was built around it. Hickory fires, common men, roasted meat, votes. His opponents responded in 1834 with an editorial cartoon called The Political Barbecue. Jackson depicted as the pig on the spit, his rivals standing behind him holding the knife. It's in the Library of Congress. Go look it up. Out of that era came the phrase barbecue, supposedly French, supposedly meaning from beard to tail, the whole animal, head to tail, beard to tail, whole hog. That's the origin story most people repeat. That's what gets said at cookouts from coast to coast.
Wikipedia's own entry on barbecue calls it a folk etymology, not supported by academic etymology. There is no French phrase barbecue. It does not exist in actual French.
The phrase was the insult, whole hog. Jackson's people didn't eat refined cuts. They ate the entire animal, nothing wasted, nothing elegant. The fake French dressed it up as scholarship. And through 2 centuries of people citing people who cited people who never checked the source, it became accepted as fact. The Taíno people who actually supplied the word don't appear in that version. They gave us the platform, the technique, and the term. And what survived was a fake French phrase that nobody ever bothered to verify. The mechanism is identical to the one that runs through this entire series. Someone with access to print wrote it down. It got repeated. It became true. The people who actually originated the thing don't appear in the version that spread. The word started as a piece of furniture. By the time it reached the American South, it had already been through 4 languages, a pirate economy, a political attack, and 2 centuries of people repeating things they hadn't checked. This is Pulse, Origins, produced by Singularity Pulse Network. Views expressed are our own. New episodes every Sunday. Follow us on @ThePulseSPN on X, the Everything app.
I'm Caden. The Pulse Brief is every weekday, 10 minutes. AI, space, crypto, cybersecurity, what matters most today? Find it wherever you listen.
I'm Knox. Every Saturday on Pulse Deep Dive, one story told in acts. This season, how AI happened, who really invented the internet, and going back to the moon 53 years later. New chapter every Saturday. Find it wherever you listen.